The morning sun beat down on Officer Ryan Taylor as he sat in his patrol car, tapping his fingers against the steering wheel. 6 months on the job, and he still felt like he had something to prove. His fellow officers at the precinct had 20-30 arrests under their belts. Ryan had 7. "You'll never make detective with those numbers," Sergeant Phillips had told him yesterday, not even looking up from his paperwork. "This isn't community college, kid. We need results." Ryan took a sip of his lukewarm coffee and grimaced. He knew what Phillips meant by results. Everyone did. It wasn't about keeping the peace or helping people. It was about arrests, plain and simple. The department didn't have official quotas, that would be illegal. But everyone knew the unspoken rule. Bring in the numbers or get left behind. His radio crackled. "All units in the vicinity of Maple and 5th, we have a report of a possible break-in." Ryan reached for his radio, but another voice cut in before he could respond. "Unit 217 responding. Officer Daniels. Always first to every call." Ryan switched off his radio in frustration. Another day of driving in circles, watching other officers build their records while he fell further behind. He pulled out of the gas station parking lot and headed toward the east side of town. Not the roughest neighborhood, but the precinct considered it a high-interest area. As he drove, he rehearsed traffic stop procedures in his mind. The way Phillips had demonstrated, firm voice, hand on holster, no room for argument. "It's about control," Phillips always said. "You give them an inch, they'll walk all over you." A black SUV with tinted windows rolled through a stop sign up ahead. Ryan felt a surge of adrenaline. It wasn't a complete violation, the driver had slowed down, but it was enough. He flipped on his lights. The SUV pulled over immediately, which almost disappointed Ryan. He'd been ready for a chase, something to tell the guys about later. He called in the license plate and approached the vehicle, one hand resting on his gun like he'd been taught. The driver's window rolled down to reveal a black man in his late 30s. James Washington had just returned home after his 4th tour overseas. 14 years in Special Forces had taught him to read situations quickly, and everything about this one felt wrong. The young officer's stance, the hand on the weapon, the barely concealed eagerness. Washington had seen it all before, just usually in war zones. Not on American streets. "License and registration," Ryan said, trying to make his voice deeper than it naturally was. Washington reached slowly for his glove compartment. "I'm going to get my registration now," he said clearly, movements deliberate. Ryan watched him closely, searching for any excuse to escalate the situation. "You know why I pulled you over?" "No, sir, I don't," Washington replied calmly. "You rolled through that stop sign back there. Complete violations carry a $150 fine in this county." Washington nodded. "I apologize, officer. I thought I made a proper stop." Ryan studied the ID Washington handed him. "James Washington, 38, local address not far from here." The photo showed a stern-faced man in military dress uniform, but revealed nothing about his rank or service. His regular driver's license didn't mention that he was Lieutenant Colonel Washington, that he had 3 Purple Hearts, or that he'd just spent the last 9 months leading classified operations that rarely made the news. "Step out of the vehicle." "Please," Ryan said. "May I ask why, officer?" "Step out of the vehicle, sir." Ryan's hand tightened on his holster. Washington had been home for all of 3 days. The first night he'd barely slept, startling at every sound in his quiet apartment. The second day he'd visited his mother, who'd fussed over him and asked when he was going to settle down. Today he'd been heading to the VA hospital for a follow-up appointment when this officer had pulled him over. He stepped out of the car slowly, hands visible. "I'm going to need to search your vehicle," Ryan announced. Washington knew his rights. "Do you have probable cause, officer?" Ryan straightened up, irritation flashing across his face. "I can smell marijuana coming from the vehicle." It was a lie. Both men knew it. Washington had never used drugs in his life. The military had strict policies, and he'd been subject to random testing for his entire career. "I haven't used any marijuana, officer," Washington said evenly. "I don't consent to a search without a warrant." Ryan's face hardened. This was not going according to plan. People usually got nervous, said too much, gave him openings. This guy was too calm. "Put your hands on the hood of the car," Ryan ordered. Washington complied, his military training kicking in. Sometimes the smartest tactical decision was to follow orders, even bad ones, especially when the person giving them had a gun and the authority to use it. Ryan patted him down roughly, finding nothing. Frustration bubbled up inside him. He needed this arrest. Philip's words echoed in his head. We need results. He reached for his body camera and switched it off. Camera malfunction, he muttered, though no one was listening. It wasn't the first time this had happened in the department. Technical issues were convenient that way. Stay right there, Ryan told Washington, then moved to search the SUV. Washington remained motionless, but his eyes tracked the young officer. He'd spent years reading body language in high-pressure situations where the wrong call meant people died. He knew exactly what was about to happen. Inside the vehicle, Ryan moved quickly. He checked under the seats, the glove compartment between cushions. Nothing. The car was spotlessly clean. Then, making sure Washington couldn't see him, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small plastic bag containing white powder. It wasn't the first time he'd carried it, just the first time he'd used it. Washington saw the movement, the slight adjustment of the officer's shoulder, as he placed something in the center console. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Years of discipline kept him still. Well, what do we have here? Ryan emerged from the car, holding up the small bag triumphantly. Looks like cocaine to me. That's not mine, Washington said quietly. That's what they all say. Ryan smiled, finally feeling in control. Turn around. You're under arrest for possession of a controlled substance. As the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, Washington took a deep breath. He'd faced insurgents, led men through ambushes, survived situations most people couldn't imagine. This was different, but in some ways it was the same. Stay calm, assess options, wait for the right moment. You have the right to remain silent, Ryan began, reciting the Miranda rights he'd practiced in the mirror countless times. Across the street, Mrs. Chen watered the plants on her porch, watching the scene unfold. She'd lived in the neighborhood for 40 years and knew Washington, had watched him grow up, go off to the military, come back on leave to visit his mother. She pulled out her phone and started recording. Ryan loaded Washington into the back of his patrol car, feeling a surge of satisfaction. Finally, a real arrest. Drug charges, no less. Phillips would have to take notice now. Washington sat silently in the back seat, eyes fixed on the divider between him and the officer. He wasn't worried about the false charges, those would be cleared up eventually. What bothered him was that this wasn't an isolated incident. This was happening in his neighborhood to his people every day, and most didn't have his resources or connections to fight back. As they drove to the station, Ryan called in the arrest, unable to keep the pride from his voice. Unit 156 coming in with one adult male, possession of cocaine, approximately 5 grams. Washington listened, calculating his next moves. One phone call. That's all he would need. Not to a lawyer, though he knew several good ones. No, he would call someone with even more authority, someone who could shine a light not just on this one corrupt officer, but on the entire system that had created him. The precinct building came into view, a blocky concrete structure with American flags flanking the entrance. Ryan parked and led his handcuffed suspect through the back door, nodding to the booking officer with newfound confidence. Got a live one here, Pete, he announced. Caught him with cocaine in his vehicle. Pete, a heavy-set man with 20 years on the force, barely looked up from his computer. Name? James Washington, Ryan supplied before Washington could speak. Pete started typing, then paused, looking up at Washington with narrowed eyes. James Washington from Pine Street? Mary Washington's son? Washington nodded once. Pete's expression changed subtly. The one who's in the military? Yes, Washington said, speaking for the first time since entering the station. Lieutenant Colonel, Special Forces. Just returned from my 4th tour 3 days ago. Ryan's smile faltered. Lieutenant Colonel? Special Forces? Pete looked from Washington to Ryan, then back again. Officer Taylor, why don't you go get the paperwork started? I'll handle booking from here. As Ryan walked away, he felt a twinge of unease, but he pushed it aside. An arrest was an arrest. By tomorrow, Phillips would be patting him on the back, and his path to detective would be one step closer. What he didn't know was that Lieutenant Colonel James Washington had spent his entire career fighting enemies of America. And now he was about to wage a different kind of battle, one against corruption much closer to home. The fluorescent lights of the police station buzzed overhead as James Washington, sat handcuffed to the metal table in the interview room. The walls were a faded beige stained with years of stress and secrets. He'd been waiting for 45 minutes, a tactic he recognized all too well. Let the suspect stew, get nervous, start thinking about all the ways their life was about to change. But Washington wasn't nervous. He was calculating. The door finally opened and Officer Ryan Taylor walked in with a folder in his hand and a smirk on his face. A second officer followed him, older with salt and pepper hair and a lieutenant's badge. Lieutenant Garcia, according to his nameplate. "So, Mr. Washington," Ryan said, sitting down across from him, "want to tell us about the drugs we found in your car?" Washington looked at him steadily. "Those weren't mine. You planted them when you turned off your body camera." Ryan's face flushed red. "That's a serious accusation." "My camera malfunctioned. It happens. Very convenient timing," Washington replied calmly. Lieutenant Garcia studied Washington with interest. "You seem very composed for someone facing felony charges." "That's because I know I'm innocent," Washington said. "And I know how this works." Ryan slapped the folder down on the table. "We have the evidence right here. 5 grams of cocaine found in your center console. That's a felony. You're looking at 10 years. Washington didn't flinch. "I'd like my phone call now." Ryan smirked again. "Calling your lawyer? Good luck with that. Public defenders in this county are overworked and underpaid. You might see one by next week." "I'm not calling a lawyer," Washington said. This caught both officers by surprise. Ryan exchanged a glance with Garcia. "Your phone call is a courtesy, not a right," Garcia said. "If you're not going to use it constructively—" "I believe it is my right," Washington interrupted. "And I'd like to make it now." Garcia studied him for a moment, then nodded to Ryan. "Take him to the phone." Ryan unlocked Washington's handcuffs from the table but kept them on his wrists. He led Washington to a wall-mounted phone in the hallway just outside the booking area. "Make it quick," Ryan said, standing close enough to hear every word. Washington dialed a number from memory. After 2 rings, someone picked up. General Harrington's office, when a crisp voice answered. "This is Lieutenant Colonel James Washington. Authorization code Echo Tango 973. I need to speak with the general immediately." There was a pause, then, "One moment, Colonel." Ryan's smug expression began to falter. "Authorization code?" After a brief wait, a deep voice came on the line. "Washington? I thought you were on leave." "What's going on?" "Sir, I've been arrested on false drug charges. Officer Ryan Taylor of the Westridge Police Department planted evidence in my vehicle after turning off his body camera." Ryan's face went pale. "What the hell?" The voice boomed, loud enough that Ryan could hear it clearly. "Where are you right now?" "Westridge Police Station. I'm being processed for felony drug possession. Put whoever's in charge on the phone now." Washington held the phone out to Ryan, who took a step back as if it might burn him. "It's for you," Washington said. "Or perhaps your lieutenant would prefer to take it." Ryan hesitated, then grabbed the phone. "Officer Taylor speaking." What followed was the most intense verbal dressing down Ryan had ever experienced. The voice on the other end identified himself as Major General Robert Harrington, commander of the Special Forces Group. He informed Ryan that Washington was not only one of his most decorated officers, but had just returned from leading a classified operation that had saved numerous American lives. "If Colonel Washington says you planted evidence, I believe him," the general said. "And by the time I'm done, the Pentagon, the governor, and every news outlet in the state will know about it. Now put your superior officer on the phone before I have the National Guard surround your station." Ryan looked at Washington, who stood calmly, watching him unravel. With shaking hands, Ryan walked to Lieutenant Garcia's office and handed him the phone. "There's a general for you," he said weakly. While Garcia took the call, Ryan returned to where Washington was waiting. The booking officer, Pete, was now standing nearby, having overheard enough to know something big was happening. "You really a lieutenant colonel?" Pete asked Washington. Washington nodded. 14 years. 4 tours, Pete let out a low whistle. "My son's in the Army, basic training at Fort Benning." "Good base," Washington said. "Tough instructors, but they'll make him strong." Ryan stood awkwardly to the side, his earlier confidence evaporated. The station was starting to buzz with activity, as word spread that something unusual was happening. Other officers glanced their way, sensing trouble. Lieutenant Garcia emerged from his office, face grim. He walked straight to Washington and personally removed his handcuffs. "Colonel Washington, I want to personally apologize for this misunderstanding. We'll be releasing you immediately and your vehicle will be returned to you." He turned to Ryan. "Officer Taylor, my office. Now." As Garcia led Ryan away, Washington rubbed his wrists where the handcuffs had been. Pete offered him a cup of water, which he accepted gratefully. "So what happens now?" Pete asked. "Now," Washington said, "things get interesting." In Garcia's office, Ryan stood at attention, sweating despite the air conditioning. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Garcia asked, voice dangerously quiet. "You just arrested a decorated Special Forces officer on false charges. An officer who, according to General Harrington, has security clearance levels higher than the mayor." "Sir, I didn't know—" "Shut up," Garcia snapped. "The general is calling the chief right now. The FBI will probably be involved by morning. And it's not just your career on the line, it's the entire department's reputation." Ryan felt sick. "The drugs—" "I can explain." Garcia held up a hand. "Save it for internal affairs. They'll be here within the hour." He picked up his phone. "And Taylor? Turn in your badge and gun. You're suspended, effective immediately." Outside, Washington was being treated with newfound respect. The same officers who would have processed him into a cell were now offering him coffee, asking about his service, treating him like a visiting dignitary instead of a suspect. Washington accepted their hospitality politely, but remained guarded. He'd seen how quickly things had changed once they learned who he was. But what about all the others who didn't have a general on speed dial? What about the countless young men from his neighborhood who'd been through these same doors, faced the same accusations, but lacked his resources and connections? The front doors of the station burst open and Chief Wilson strode in, looking harried. He spotted Washington immediately and made a beeline for him. "Colonel Washington," he said, extending his hand. "Chief Thomas Wilson. I just got off the phone with General Harrington. I want to personally assure you that we're taking this matter extremely seriously." Washington shook his hand firmly. "I appreciate that, Chief. We'll need your statement, of course, but that can wait until tomorrow if you prefer. Your vehicle is being brought around now." "Actually," Washington said, "I'd like to file my statement today, while everything is still fresh." The chief nodded, though he looked uncomfortable. "Of course. Lieutenant Garcia will take your statement personally. And I'd like to see the evidence bag containing the drugs Officer Taylor allegedly found in my vehicle," Washington added. The chief hesitated. "I'm not sure that's standard procedure." "I think we're well beyond standard procedure, don't you, Chief?" Washington's voice remained polite, but there was steel beneath it. Meanwhile, across town, Mrs. Chen had been busy. The video she'd taken of Washington's arrest had already been shared with her daughter, who worked as a producer at the local news station. By early evening, it would be the lead story. Decorated Special Forces officer framed by local police. Back at the station, Washington sat across from Lieutenant Garcia, methodically recounting the events of the day. He described how Ryan had turned off his body camera, how he'd watched him plant the evidence, how the arrest had proceeded. His military training had taught him to observe and remember details, and he provided them with precision. "And you're certain Officer Taylor planted the drugs?" Garcia asked. "Absolutely certain," Washington confirmed. "I saw him reach into his pocket, then place something in my center console. When he found it moments later, he wasn't surprised at all." Garcia made notes, his expression troubled. "Colonel, I want you to know that this kind of behavior is not what we stand for." Washington looked at him thoughtfully. "Isn't it, though? Your department patrols my old neighborhood much more heavily than the West Side. Your officers make more arrests there, issue more citations. Officer Taylor didn't come up with this tactic on his own. He learned it." Garcia shifted uncomfortably. "We enforce the law equally throughout the city." "The statistics would suggest otherwise," Washington said. "I've been away for years serving my country, but my mother still lives in that neighborhood. She tells me stories, and now I've experienced it firsthand." Before Garcia could respond, there was a knock at the door. An officer poked his head in. "Lieutenant, the FBI is here, and there's a news van outside." Garcia closed his notebook. "We'll continue this later, Colonel." As Washington was escorted to the front of the station, he saw the chaos unfolding. FBI agents in suits were talking with the chief. Officers were huddled in small groups, speaking in hushed tones. and through the glass doors he could see camera crews setting up outside. His phone rang. It was General Harrington again. "Washington, you okay?" "Yes, sir. They're releasing me now." "Good. The Pentagon's Public Affairs Office is already fielding calls from reporters. This is going to blow up." The general paused. "What do you want to do about it?" Washington watched as Ryan was led past him, head down, escorted by 2 senior officers. The young cop glanced up briefly, his face a mix of fear and resentment. "I want to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else," Washington said. "This isn't about one bad officer. It's about a system." "You're thinking bigger than just clearing your name," the general observed. "Yes, sir. Much bigger." As Washington stepped outside the police station, cameras turned toward him. Reporters shouted questions. In the crowd, he spotted Mrs. Chen, who gave him a small nod. He'd known her since he was a boy. She'd watched him grow up, leave for the military, return on his brief visits home. She'd seen what happened and had done something about it. Washington straightened his shoulders the way he did before briefing his team before a mission. He'd faced enemy fire, led men through impossible situations, navigated political complexities in foreign countries. Now he was about to start a different kind of battle, one fought not with weapons but with truth. A reporter thrust a microphone toward him. "Colonel Washington, can you tell us what happened today?" Washington looked directly into the camera. "What happened to me today has been happening in this city for years. The difference is I'm in a position to do something about it. And I intend to." Across town, Ryan sat alone in an empty interview room waiting for internal affairs. His badge and gun had been taken. His career, which had barely begun, was likely over. All because he'd picked the wrong man to frame. He thought about Washington's face, the calm, the control, the absolute certainty that justice would prevail. Ryan had never seen someone so sure of themselves, so unafraid in the face of authority. It was unnerving. The door opened and 2 stern-faced internal affairs officers walked in. They placed a recorder on the table and introduced themselves. Officer Taylor, one said, "We're investigating serious allegations of misconduct. Are you prepared to make a statement?" Ryan looked at the recorder, then at the officers. His mind raced through his options. He could deny everything, claim Washington was lying. But there was Mrs. Chen's video. There would be fingerprint evidence on the bag. And if they started looking at his previous arrests, what would they find? "I want to make a deal," he said suddenly. The officers exchanged glances. "What kind of deal?" "Immunity," Ryan said. "I'll tell you everything, not just about today, but about how things really work in this department. Who taught me? Who looks the other way? Everything." Outside, as Washington drove away from the station in his now returned SUV, his phone rang again. It was Pete, the booking officer. "Colonel," he said, "you should know. Taylor's talking to Internal Affairs. Word is he's naming names. This thing's about to get a lot bigger." Washington thanked him for the information and hung up. He drove toward his mother's house, where he knew she'd be waiting, worried after seeing the news. The sun was setting over the city, casting long shadows. Washington thought about his men still deployed overseas. He thought about the oath he'd taken to defend his country against all enemies, foreign and domestic. He'd never imagined that one day, that fight would bring him back to his own hometown, to the very streets where he'd grown up. But some battles chose you. And James Washington had never been one to back down from a fight. The morning after his arrest, James Washington sat at his mother's kitchen table drinking coffee and watching the local news. His face filled the screen as the anchor described him as a decorated war hero wrongfully arrested on false drug charges. The story had spread overnight, picked up by national networks and trending on social media. "They keep showing the same picture of you in your uniform," his mother Mary said, refilling his cup. At 65, she still moved with the energy of someone 20 years younger. "The one from your promotion ceremony?" Washington nodded. The military had released his official photo, dress uniform, ribbons and medals displayed across his chest, face serious and composed. The perfect image to contrast with his treatment by the police. "This isn't how I wanted to spend my leave," he said quietly. Mary sat across from him, laying her hand on his. "Maybe this is exactly what you needed to be doing. Maybe this is why you came home when you did." Washington's phone buzzed. Another message from General Harrington. "Pentagon press conference at 1300. Secretary of Defense making statement about your situation. Unprecedented. The doorbell rang. Mary peeked through the curtains. "Reporters," she sighed. "They've been driving by all morning." Washington had been fielding calls since dawn, from military colleagues, old friends, community leaders, and lawyers offering their services. He'd already spoken with the ACLU and 3 different civil rights organizations. Everyone wanted a piece of this story, a chance to be part of what was quickly becoming a national conversation. His phone rang again. The caller ID showed Westridge Police Department. "Colonel Washington." Chief Wilson's voice was tense. "I was hoping we could meet today. Just you and me off the record." "I don't think that's a good idea, Chief," Washington replied. "Anything you have to say should be on the record." "Please," the chief pressed. "This situation is escalating by the hour. The mayor's office is involved now. The FBI has seized Officer Taylor's locker and personal devices. We need to find a way forward that works for everyone." Washington thought for a moment. "I'll meet you, but not alone. I'll bring my own representation and we'll meet at a neutral location." They settled on a meeting at the public library at noon. Washington hung up and immediately called Thomas Grant, an old friend who now worked as a civil rights attorney. "They're scrambling," Thomas said when Washington told him about the call. "This is a PR nightmare for them. The last thing they want is a high-profile lawsuit from a war hero." "This isn't about money," Washington said firmly. "I know, James, but right now your leverage is at its peak. We need to use it." After breakfast, Washington sat down at his mother's computer and began researching the Westridge Police Department. He pulled up arrest statistics, complaint records, demographic data on the force versus the community. The picture that emerged confirmed what he already knew: a pattern of disparate enforcement and questionable practices, particularly in minority neighborhoods. His military training had taught him to gather intelligence before any operation. Know your terrain, know your opposition. This would be no different. By 11:30, Washington and Thomas were walking into the public library, a modernist building of glass and steel in the center of town. They chose a private study room in the back, away from curious onlookers. Chief Wilson arrived precisely at noon, alone and in civilian clothes rather than his uniform. A deliberate choice, Washington noted. The chief looked tired, the bags under his eyes suggesting a sleepless night. "Thank you for meeting me, Colonel," he said, extending his hand. Washington shook it firmly. "This is Thomas Grant, my attorney." They sat around a small table. The chief placed a folder between them. "Before we begin," he said, "I want to personally apologize for what happened. It was unacceptable and it does not represent the values of my department." "With all due respect, Chief," Washington replied, "I think it represents exactly what's been happening in this department for years. The only difference is that this time you arrested someone who couldn't be intimidated or silenced." The chief's jaw tightened. Officer Taylor's actions were his own. He's been suspended pending investigation, and I assure you he will face appropriate consequences. "Officer Taylor didn't create this culture," Washington said. "He's a product of it." Thomas leaned forward. "My client isn't interested in scapegoating one young officer. We're looking at a pattern of behavior that extends throughout your department." The chief opened his folder and pulled out a document. "We're prepared to offer a formal apology and a settlement that—" "I'm not interested in a settlement," Washington interrupted. "Or an NDA." The chief looked surprised. "Then what do you want?" Washington placed his own folder on the table. "Reform. Real measurable change in how your department operates, especially in minority neighborhoods." He outlined his demands: an independent review of the department's arrest practices and racial profiling statistics, body cameras that couldn't be turned off during stops, civilian oversight committee with actual authority, and comprehensive retraining for all officers. "That's ambitious," the chief said carefully. "It's necessary," Washington replied, "and non-negotiable." As they continued their discussion across town at the police station, the atmosphere was tense. Officers clustered in small groups talking in low voices. The FBI had set up in one of the conference rooms, interviewing officers one by one. Ryan Taylor sat alone in the break room, untouched coffee growing cold in front of him. His colleagues gave him a wide berth, some from anger, others from fear of association. His phone had been confiscated as evidence, his apartment searched. The reality of his situation was finally sinking in. Lieutenant Garcia entered and sat across from him. "Internal Affairs wants to see you again. They've been reviewing your previous arrests." Ryan looked up, panic flashing across his face. All of them? Focusing on drug cases, Garcia said. There are similarities they're concerned about. Ryan rubbed his face. I was just doing what everyone does. What I was taught to do. Nobody taught you to plant evidence, Garcia snapped. No? Ryan laughed bitterly. Phillips told me my first week, sometimes you gotta help the evidence along. What did you think he meant? And you all knew. You saw the numbers, the patterns. Nobody asked questions when the arrest counts went up. Garcia looked uncomfortable. You made your choices. Yeah, I did, Ryan agreed. But I didn't make them in a vacuum. The station door opened and Officer Phillips walked in, escorted by 2 FBI agents. He caught Ryan's eye briefly before being led to the interview rooms. The message was clear. The investigation was widening. Back at the library, the meeting was wrapping up. The chief had taken pages of notes but made no commitments. I'll need to discuss this with the mayor and the city attorney, he said, gathering his papers. Of course, Washington replied. But understand, Chief, this story isn't going away. The world is watching now. As if on cue, Washington's phone buzzed with a news alert. Pentagon condemns treatment of Special Forces officer by local police. The chief saw it too. His face tightened. I'll be in touch, he said, standing to leave. After the chief departed, Thomas turned to Washington. He's going to try to ride this out, hope the media moves on to the next story. Then we'll need to make sure that doesn't happen, Washington said. That afternoon, Washington's mother's living room became an impromptu headquarters. Thomas had brought in 2 paralegals from his firm. Community activists Washington had known since childhood dropped by to offer support. Mrs. Chen arrived with her daughter from the news station, bringing Chinese food for everyone. The station wants to do an exclusive interview, Mrs. Chen's daughter explained. Your full story unedited. Washington considered this. Set it up, but on one condition, we do it from my old neighborhood. I want people to see where I come from, understand the community that shaped me. As they planned, Washington's phone rang again. A Washington, D.C. area code. Colonel Washington? This is Congresswoman Eleanor Hayes. I'm the ranking member on the House Armed Services Committee. Do you have a moment to talk? The Congresswoman explained that she'd been briefed on his situation and wanted to help. This intersection of military service and policing issues is drawing bipartisan attention. We're holding hearings next month on community policing reforms. We'd like you to testify. The opportunity to speak at a congressional hearing would elevate the issue beyond one incident in one town. It would put a national spotlight on practices that affected communities across the country. I'd be honored, Congresswoman, Washington said. By evening, the story had evolved. News outlets were now digging into the Westridge Police Department's history, uncovering previous complaints and lawsuits that had been quietly settled. Ryan Taylor's record was being scrutinized, as were the department's arrest statistics. What had started as one incident was expanding into an examination of systemic issues. Washington's phone rang once more. It was Pete, the booking officer from the station. Colonel, I thought you should know the FBI found a pattern in Taylor's arrests. 5 other cases where suspects claimed he planted evidence. All black men, all in your old neighborhood. They're reopening those cases now. Thank you for telling me, Washington said. There's more, Pete continued, his voice lower. Taylor's talking. Named Phillips as his mentor, said Phillips showed him how to help the evidence along when they needed arrests. Said it was common practice, encouraged even. FBI's building a bigger case now. After hanging up, Washington sat quietly processing this information. 5 other men had gone through what he had experienced, but without his connections, his resources, his platform. Some might still be in prison, their lives derailed by false charges. We need to find those men, he told Thomas. Offer them representation, support. Thomas nodded. I'll start making calls tomorrow. As night fell, Washington stepped onto his mother's porch, needing a moment alone. The street was quiet now, though a news van remained parked at the corner. His phone had finally stopped ringing. He thought about his men, his unit still deployed overseas. They'd be following this story, watching how their commander handled this battle on home soil. He thought about the young people in this neighborhood, who'd grown up expecting unfair treatment from those sworn to protect them. Washington had never sought the spotlight. In Special Forces, their most successful operations were the ones that never made the news. But this was different. This fight needed to be public, visible, impossible to ignore. His mother joined him on the porch, wrapping a cardigan around her shoulders against the evening chill. "You know," she said, "when you told me you were coming home for a while, I thought you'd finally have some peace. After all these years, all those deployments." Washington smiled ruefully. "I'm not sure I know what to do with peace, Mom." She took his hand, her fingers small but strong in his. "You're fighting a different kind of war now, just as important as the ones overseas. Maybe more important," he said quietly. The next morning, Washington dressed carefully in his civilian clothes, pressed slacks, and a simple button-down shirt. No uniform today. The television interview would focus on him as a citizen, not just a soldier. As he prepared, the news reported that Officer Ryan Taylor had been formally charged with evidence tampering, filing false reports, and civil rights violations. Sergeant Phillips had been suspended. The FBI had expanded its investigation to include the entire department's arrest practices over the past 5 years. The chief had issued a statement promising full cooperation and transparency, but made no mention of Washington's proposed reforms. The battle lines were being drawn. Thomas arrived with news of his own. "I've located 3 of the 5 men from Taylor's previous cases. 2 are still incarcerated. We're filing motions today to have their cases reviewed." Washington nodded grimly. "And the department?" "Still hoping to contain this," Thomas said. "They've offered to drop all charges against you officially and issue a public apology if you'll sign an agreement not to sue." "Not interested," Washington replied. His phone buzzed with a text from General Harrington. "POTUS mentioned your situation in morning briefing. Stay strong. Nation is watching." The pressure was building on all sides. What had started as one corrupt officer making one bad decision was exposing a web of practices and policies that had affected countless lives. Mrs. Chen's daughter arrived with her news crew, setting up in the living room. Before they began recording, she showed Washington something on her tablet, a social media campaign that had sprung up overnight. Stand with Washington was trending nationally, with veterans, activists, and ordinary citizens sharing the story. "People are listening," she said. "They're ready for this conversation." Washington took a deep breath as the cameras prepared to roll. He'd faced danger many times before, stared down threats most people couldn't imagine. But this was different. This was personal in a way combat never had been. This was about his home, his community, the place that had shaped him before he ever put on a uniform. The red light on the camera blinked on. The interviewer smiled encouragingly. "Colonel Washington, thank you for speaking with us today. Could you tell our viewers in your own words what happened to you 2 days ago?" Washington looked directly into the camera, his voice steady and clear. "What happened to me was not an isolated incident. It was not one bad officer having one bad day. It was the predictable result of a system that has lost sight of who it's meant to serve and protect." As he spoke, across town, Ryan Taylor was being led into court for his arraignment. Head down, avoiding the cameras, the young officer who had been so confident, so certain of his power just days ago, now faced the consequences of a system he'd thought would always protect him. And in the police station, Chief Wilson stared at the mounting evidence of what had been happening in his department for years. Patterns he should have seen, practices he should have stopped. The comfortable fiction that these were isolated incidents was crumbling beneath the weight of data and testimony. Washington continued his interview, laying out not just what had happened to him, but his vision for what needed to change. He spoke with the clarity and authority of someone used to briefing generals and politicians on matters of national security. Because this was a matter of national security, the security of citizens to live without fear in their own communities, the security of a nation that claimed to provide equal justice for all, the battle was just beginning. 1 week after his arrest, James Washington stood outside the Westridge County Courthouse, surrounded by reporters and cameras. The morning sun cast long shadows across the stone steps as he adjusted his tie, his first time wearing civilian formal wear since returning home. "Colonel, what are you expecting from today's hearing?" A reporter called out. "Justice," Washington replied simply, "not just for me but for everyone affected by these practices." Inside, the courtroom was packed. The case had drawn national attention, with major news networks sending correspondents. On one side sat Washington with Thomas Grant and a team of lawyers from the ACLU. On the other, city attorneys representing the police department, looking tense. Chief Wilson sat stone-faced in the front row. Behind him were community members, activists, and several uniformed military personnel who had come to support Washington. Mrs. Chen was there too, nodding encouragingly when Washington glanced her way. The judge entered and everyone rose. Judge Helen Rivera was known for her no-nonsense approach and independence from local politics. Exactly why this hearing had been assigned to her. Courtroom, we're here today on multiple matters related to the arrest of Lieutenant Colonel James Washington, she began. Let's start with the status of the criminal charges. The district attorney stood. Your Honor, the state has dropped all charges against Colonel Washington. Our investigation has conclusively determined that the evidence was planted by Officer Ryan Taylor. Washington remained impassive, though he noted the DA's careful wording, placing all blame on Taylor, as if he had acted alone. Furthermore, the DA continued, we are reviewing all previous arrests made by Officer Taylor, particularly those involving alleged drug possession. 3 cases have already been identified where evidence may have been fabricated. Thomas Grant rose next. Your Honor, we've filed a civil rights lawsuit against the Westridge Police Department on behalf of Colonel Washington and 3 other individuals who were wrongfully arrested by Officer Taylor using similar tactics. Judge Rivera looked over her glasses at the city attorneys. I presume the city will be filing a response? Yes, Your Honor, the lead attorney replied. But we would like to note that we have initiated settlement discussions with Mr. Grant and his clients. The judge made a note. Very well. Now regarding the request for a temporary restraining order requiring body cameras to remain active during all police interactions. The legal proceedings continued for over an hour, with both sides presenting arguments about the proposed reforms. Washington listened carefully, noting how the city attorneys tried to frame Taylor's actions as those of a rogue officer, rather than symptoms of a deeper problem. When the hearing concluded, Judge Rivera announced she would issue her rulings within 3 days. As everyone filed out of the courtroom, Washington was approached by a young black man he didn't recognize. Colonel Washington, I'm Dwayne Lewis, he said, extending his hand. I just wanted to thank you. I was one of Officer Taylor's arrests last year. Spent 8 months in county before they finally dropped the charges for lack of evidence. But by then I'd lost my job, my apartment. Washington shook his hand firmly. I'm sorry that happened to you, Mr. Lewis. Are you working with Thomas now? Yeah, Lewis nodded. Your case gave me the courage to come forward. They're reviewing my conviction now. Outside the courthouse, the press was waiting. Chief Wilson hurried past the cameras, ignoring questions. The city attorneys made brief, non-committal statements about working toward a resolution. When Washington emerged, the reporters surged forward. Colonel, are you satisfied with the charges being dropped? Washington stepped up to the microphones. This was never about just clearing my name. It's about addressing a pattern of behavior that has harmed countless citizens, particularly in minority communities. Today was a first step, but there's much more work to be done. A reporter from a national network pushed forward. Is it true the Pentagon is monitoring this case? Has the Secretary of Defense been in contact with you? I can confirm there's significant interest at the federal level. Washington replied carefully. This case has highlighted issues that exist not just in Westridge, but in departments across the country. As Washington fielded questions, across town in the county jail, Ryan Taylor sat alone in a holding cell. He'd been denied bail, deemed a flight risk by the same judicial system he had once served. His attorney, provided by the police union, had advised him to consider a plea deal. The evidence against him was mounting daily. The FBI had found text messages between him and Sergeant Phillips discussing arrests and making cases stick. Body camera footage from previous arrests showed suspicious gaps. And 3 of his former arrestees had come forward with stories remarkably similar to Washington's. The worst part was the isolation. His fellow officers had abandoned him, the department was distancing itself, and the union's support was lukewarm at best. He was the sacrificial lamb, offered up to protect the system. Back at Mary Washington's house, which had become the unofficial headquarters for the growing movement, a strategy meeting was underway. Thomas Grant was there with his legal team. Community activists filled the living room. Representatives from national civil rights organizations had flown in to lend support. The city's offering a settlement, Thomas announced. $2 million and a formal apology. And the reforms? Washington asked. They're willing to implement body cameras that can't be deactivated and increase diversity training, Thomas replied. But they're pushing back on the Civilian Oversight Committee and the independent review of arrest practices. Then we keep pushing, Washington said firmly. This has never been about money. His phone rang, General Harrington again. Washington, the secretary wants to meet with you. Tomorrow, Pentagon. How soon can you be in D.C.? Washington looked around the room at the team that had assembled, the momentum they'd built. Sir, with all due respect, I need to stay here right now. We're at a critical point. There was a pause, then. Understood, Colonel. The secretary can come to you. There are some developments you should be aware of. The next day, Washington met with the Secretary of Defense in a private room at the local federal building. 2 high-ranking Pentagon officials accompanied him, along with aides carrying classified folders. Colonel Washington, the secretary greeted him. Your situation has drawn attention at the highest levels. The president asked me to look into it personally. Washington stood at attention. I appreciate that, sir. At ease, Colonel. The secretary gestured to a chair. What happened to you is unacceptable. But it's also created an opportunity for change that extends beyond one police department. He explained that the Department of Defense was launching a new initiative focused on the treatment of veterans, particularly veterans of color, by law enforcement. Washington was being asked to lead it. We're allocating significant resources, the secretary continued. Training programs, community outreach, policy development. Your background in special forces, combined with your experience in this situation, makes you uniquely qualified. Washington considered the offer carefully. It would give him a national platform, resources, institutional backing, but it would also take him away from the immediate fight in Westridge. I'm honored by the offer, sir, he said, but I need to see this through locally first. What happened to me is happening to people without my resources or connections every day. They don't get Pentagon support or national media attention. The secretary nodded thoughtfully. I understand. The position will remain open. In the meantime, is there anything we can do to support your efforts here? Actually, yes, Washington replied. There is. The next morning, Judge Rivera's chambers received an unusual communication, a formal letter from the Department of Defense expressing concern about the treatment of a decorated officer and offering to provide resources for police, training and reform in Westridge. When the news broke that the Pentagon was getting directly involved, the city's position weakened considerably. The mayor, who had been largely silent on the issue, suddenly called for a comprehensive review of police practices. City council members who had defended the police department began discussing the need for accountability and transparency. Meanwhile, the FBI investigation was expanding. Agents had seized records going back 5 years and were interviewing former arrestees. What they found painted a disturbing picture. A pattern of questionable arrests, primarily of Black and Hispanic men, with Officer Taylor as just one participant in a wider practice. At the police station, morale was at an all-time low. Officers felt under siege, unsure who would be implicated next. Sergeant Phillips had been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. Lieutenant Garcia was cooperating with the FBI, providing internal documents and testimony about departmental practices. 3 days after the courthouse hearing, Judge Rivera issued her ruling. She granted the temporary restraining order requiring body cameras to remain active during all police interactions. She also ordered an independent audit of the department's arrest practices, with results to be made public. The evidence presented suggests a pattern of behavior that warrants immediate intervention, her ruling stated. The public interest demands transparency and accountability. It was a significant victory, but Washington knew it was just the beginning. The real challenge would be ensuring these changes led to lasting reform, not just temporary measures to weather the public relations storm. That evening, Washington received an unexpected visitor at his mother's house. Chief Wilson had come alone out of uniform, requesting a private conversation. Mary showed him to the back porch where Washington was reviewing documents with Thomas. The chief looked uncomfortable, out of place in the modest family home. Colonel Washington, he began, I wanted to speak with you directly, without lawyers or press. Thomas started to object, but Washington held up a hand. It's all right. Give us a few minutes. After Thomas reluctantly stepped inside, the chief sat down heavily. I've been chief for 7 years, he said. Before that, 20 years on the force. I thought I knew my department. Washington waited, saying nothing. The FBI showed me the evidence today, the chief continued. Not just Taylor, not just Phillips. A pattern going back years. Officers I trusted, practices I should have questioned. He rubbed his face. I'm resigning tomorrow. Resigning won't fix the problems, Washington said. No, the chief agreed. But it might give the department a chance at a fresh start, with leadership that isn't compromised. He looked directly at Washington. I wanted you to hear it from me first. And I wanted to say, you were right. This wasn't one bad officer. It was a culture. A culture I allowed to continue. After the chief left, Washington briefed Thomas on their conversation. This changes the dynamics, Thomas noted. A new chief could be more open to our demands or could dig in harder against outside influence. Either way, Washington replied, we keep pushing. The next day, Chief Wilson's resignation made headlines. The mayor announced an immediate nationwide search for a replacement, promising to prioritize candidates with experience in community-oriented policing and reform. At the county courthouse, Ryan Taylor appeared for another hearing. His attorney had negotiated a plea deal, guilty to evidence tampering and civil rights violations in exchange for testimony against others in the department. The judge accepted the plea but delayed sentencing pending completion of his cooperation. As Taylor was led from the courtroom, he passed Washington, who had come to observe the proceedings. Their eyes met briefly, the young officer who had thought himself untouchable and the man whose life he had tried to destroy. Taylor looked away first, shoulders slumped under the weight of his actions. Washington felt no satisfaction, only a grim determination to ensure the system changed. Taylor was part of the problem but not its cause. He was both perpetrator and product of a broken approach to policing. That afternoon, Washington received more news. Judge Rivera had appointed a special master to oversee the implementation of reforms in the Westridge Police Department. The city council, seeing which way the wind was blowing, had unanimously approved funding for the Civilian Oversight Committee that Washington had demanded. They're giving in on everything, Thomas said, reviewing the city's latest settlement offer. Full implementation of all the reforms we asked for, compensation for all identified victims of false arrests, and a public acknowledgement of the systematic issues. Why the sudden change? Washington asked. The FBI findings are worse than anyone expected, Thomas explained. They're terrified of a RICO investigation. Plus, the Pentagon's involvement has them running scared. Nobody wants to be seen opposing a war hero in the Department of Defense. Washington considered this, set up a meeting with the mayor and city council. I want to discuss the implementation details personally. No more intermediaries. The meeting was scheduled for the following day at City Hall. Washington arrived early, accompanied by Thomas and representatives from the community organizations that had rallied around the cause. The mayor and full council were waiting, along with city attorneys and the interim police chief. Colonel Washington, the mayor began, we want to thank you for agreeing to this meeting. The city of Westridge is committed to addressing the issues you've raised and implementing meaningful reforms. Washington nodded acknowledgement. I appreciate that commitment, but I need to be clear. These reforms aren't just about policies on paper. They're about changing a culture that has harmed real people in real communities. For the next 2 hours, they discussed specifics, the composition and authority of the Civilian Oversight Committee, training requirements for officers, transparency measures, community engagement initiatives. Washington was meticulous, pushing back when the city tried to water down requirements or extend implementation timelines. One more thing, Washington said as the meeting was wrapping up. The settlement needs to include funding for a community center in the East Side neighborhood, a place for youth programs, job training, legal services, the kind of resources that prevent crime instead of just punishing it. The mayor hesitated, looking at the budget director, who frowned. That's not directly related to police reform, one of the council members objected. It's entirely related, Washington replied. You can't fix policing without addressing the conditions that lead to over-policing in the first place. This isn't just about stopping bad practices, it's about building something better. After some discussion, The mayor agreed to include the community center in the settlement package, with a 5-year funding commitment. As Washington left City Hall, a small crowd had gathered outside, community members who had been following the case, waiting to hear the outcome. Mrs. Chen was there, along with Dwayne Lewis and others who had been affected by the department's practices. Did they agree? Someone called out. Washington raised a hand for quiet. They've accepted all our demands, including funding for a new community center. The reforms will be implemented under court supervision, with a civilian oversight committee to ensure compliance. A cheer went up from the crowd. People hugged each other, some wiping away tears. It was a victory many had thought impossible just weeks ago. That evening, Washington sat alone on his mother's porch, reflecting on everything that had happened since that traffic stop. His phone buzzed with a message from General Harrington. Secretary says offer still stands when you're ready. Take your time. The Pentagon position would give him a chance to drive similar changes nationally, to help ensure that what happened in Westridge wasn't unique. But there was still work to be done here first. Implementation to oversee, a community to rebuild, trust to restore. Washington looked out at the neighborhood where he'd grown up, where his mother still greeted neighbors by name and kept track of everyone's children and grandchildren. This was why he had served all those years, deployed to distant lands, faced danger without hesitation, to protect communities like this one, to uphold the values America claimed to represent. The irony wasn't lost on him that his greatest battle had come not in some foreign conflict zone, but on the streets of his hometown. And perhaps his most important service wouldn't be the classified missions he'd led overseas, but this fight for justice at home. His mother joined him on the porch, a cup of tea in her hands. "I'm proud of you, James," she said quietly. "Your father would be too." Washington smiled, putting an arm around her shoulders. The mention of his father, who had died while Washington was deployed on his second tour, brought a familiar ache. He'd been a principled man, a community leader who had taught Washington the importance of standing up for what was right, no matter the cost. "I think we made a difference, Mom," he said. She nodded, looking out at the neighborhood they both loved. "You did. But remember what your father always said. Change is a marathon, not a sprint," Washington finished. It had been one of his father's favorite sayings. The road ahead would be long. Policies could be changed with signatures on documents, but changing hearts and minds, rebuilding trust between communities and those sworn to protect them, that would take time, persistence, and continued vigilance. But for the first time since he'd returned home, Washington felt something he hadn't expected to find in this fight: hope. Not just for justice in his own case, but for the possibility of real, lasting change in a system that had failed too many for too long. And if a corrupt young officer's worst mistake had been choosing the wrong man to frame, a man with the resources, platform, and determination to expose not just one incident but an entire broken system, then perhaps some good would come from it after. All 6 months had passed since the day Officer Ryan Taylor pulled over Lieutenant Colonel James Washington and changed both their lives forever. The late autumn sun cast long shadows across the newly renovated community center as Washington unlocked the front doors. The East Side Community Center had once been an abandoned school building, its windows boarded up, graffiti marking its walls. Now it stood as a symbol of transformation. Fresh paint, new windows, the sound of children's laughter echoing through its halls. The settlement money had made this possible, turning a forgotten building into a vibrant hub for the neighborhood. Washington walked through the main hall, checking that everything was ready. Today would be the first meeting of the Westridge Police Department's Citizen Oversight Committee, and he had insisted it be held here, in the heart of the community most affected by the department's previous practices. "Looking good, Colonel," called a familiar voice. Dwayne Lewis emerged from one of the side rooms, clipboard in hand. After his wrongful conviction had been overturned, Washington had hired him as the center's assistant director. "Everything set up in the meeting room?" Washington asked. "Chairs arranged, water pitchers filled, recording equipment tested," Lewis confirmed. "The community representatives are already arriving. Some of the officers look a bit uncomfortable, though." Washington nodded. "That's to be expected. This isn't their territory, and that was precisely the point. For too long, interactions between the police and the community had happened on the department's terms, in their spaces. under their rules. Part of changing the dynamics meant changing the setting, bringing officers into the community as partners rather than occupiers. Washington checked his watch. The meeting would start in 30 minutes. He headed to his office to review his notes one last time. The last 6 months had been a whirlwind of activity. After the settlement was finalized, Washington had taken a leave of absence from the military to oversee the implementation of reforms. The Pentagon had been surprisingly supportive, recognizing the importance of the work he was doing. The changes had been sweeping. Every officer now wore a body camera that couldn't be deactivated during interactions with the public. The department had undergone comprehensive retraining on de-escalation techniques and implicit bias. Hiring practices had been overhauled to increase diversity in the force. And today, the Civilian Oversight Committee would hold its inaugural meeting, with Washington serving as its first chairperson. Not everyone had been happy about the changes. Some officers had resigned rather than adapt to the new requirements. Others had resisted passively, going through the motions without embracing the spirit of reform. But a significant number, particularly younger officers, had welcomed the opportunity to rebuild trust with the communities they served. Washington's phone buzzed with a text message. Running 5 minutes late, traffic, A. Rodriguez. Anna Rodriguez was the new police chief selected after a nationwide search. She had come from a department known for its community policing model and had been chosen specifically for her commitment to reform. Washington had been on the selection committee and had pushed hard for her appointment. Despite resistance from those who wanted someone from within the department, there was another knock at his office door. Mrs. Chen stood there, dressed formally for the meeting. "The reporters are setting up outside," she said. "They want to know if you'll make a statement before the meeting." Washington shook his head. "No statements until after." "This isn't about me or the press. It's about the work," Mrs. Chen smiled knowingly. "That's what I told them you'd say." She hesitated, then added, "Officer Taylor is here." Washington looked up, surprised. "Taylor? He wasn't invited." "He's not trying to come in," Mrs. Chen clarified. "He's just waiting outside. Says he wants to speak with you privately." Washington considered this. Ryan Taylor had served 6 months of his 18-month sentence before being released on probation, his cooperation with the FBI investigation having earned him leniency. Washington hadn't seen him since the sentencing hearing. "Tell him I'll speak with him after the meeting," Washington decided. As Mrs. Chen left, Washington reflected on the complex feelings Taylor evoked in him. The young officer had tried to destroy his life, had successfully destroyed others. Yet Washington also recognized that Taylor had been shaped by a corrupt system, had been taught that his actions were acceptable, even expected. The recovery process wasn't just about punishing individuals. It was about changing the environment that had produced them. Washington gathered his notes and headed to the meeting room, where people were beginning to assemble. The civilian members of the Oversight Committee represented a cross-section of the community: a high school teacher, a local business owner, a retired judge, a youth pastor, and Mrs. Chen herself. The police department was represented by Chief Rodriguez and 2 officers chosen by their peers. The mood was tentative, with civilians and officers sitting on opposite sides of the table, eyeing each other warily. Washington took his place at the head of the table. "Thank you all for being here," he began. "What we're doing today isn't just historic for Westridge. It's part of a national conversation about policing, community, and justice." He outlined the committee's responsibilities: reviewing citizen complaints, examining patterns of officer behavior, recommending policy changes, and serving as a bridge between the department and the community. "This isn't about creating an adversarial relationship," Washington emphasized. "It's about building a partnership based on accountability and mutual respect." Chief Rodriguez spoke next, acknowledging the department's troubled history but focusing on the path forward. "We can't change the past," she said, "but we can learn from it and commit to doing better." As the meeting progressed, the initial tension began to ease. Both sides shared concerns and hopes, finding more common ground than many had expected. They established procedures for handling complaints, scheduled community listening sessions, and set goals for the coming year. Washington observed the interactions carefully. This was just the beginning of a long process, but already he could see the potential for real change. When the meeting concluded, reporters were waiting outside. Chief Rodriguez fielded most of their questions, emphasizing the department's commitment to reform. Washington added brief comments about the importance of community involvement and ongoing vigilance. After the press dispersed, Washington spotted Ryan Taylor standing awkwardly near the center's entrance. He was thinner than Washington remembered, his face more lined, as if he'd aged years in just 6 months. He was dressed in civilian clothes, jeans and a button-down shirt, a far cry from the confident young officer in uniform who had pulled Washington over that day. "Colonel Washington," Taylor said as Washington approached. "Thank you for seeing me." "Let's walk," Washington suggested, gesturing toward the small park adjacent to the community center. They walked in silence for a moment, an unlikely pair. The decorated officer whose wrongful arrest had exposed a corrupt system, and the disgraced cop whose actions had set it all in motion. "I heard you're working with the Justice Department now," Washington said finally. "Consulting on police reform," Taylor nodded. "Part of my probation agreement. I talked to departments about what happened here, how things went wrong, warning signs to look for." He paused. "It's not easy telling my story over and over, admitting what I did. But it seems necessary." "It is necessary," Washington confirmed. "Change doesn't happen without honesty." They reached a bench overlooking a small playground where children were playing, their laughter carrying on the autumn breeze. "Why did you want to see me?" Washington asked directly. Taylor took a deep breath. "I've apologized to a lot of people over the past 6 months. Spoken at hearings, given depositions, met with some of the men whose lives I ruined." He looked down at his hands. "But I never apologized to you." "Not directly." Washington studied him carefully. "And that's why you're here? To apologize?" "Yes, and," Taylor hesitated, "to ask you something." Washington waited. "Why did you push for the reform instead of just taking the money and walking away?" Taylor asked. "After what I did to you, nobody would have blamed you for wanting to put it all behind you. Most people would have." Washington considered the question. "Because it was never just about me. What you did to me that day, you'd done to others before. Your colleagues had done it too. It was a pattern, a practice, a culture. Taking money and walking away wouldn't have changed any of that." "But why did you care?" Taylor pressed. "You had your life in the military, your career. This wasn't your problem to fix." "It became my problem the moment you pulled me over," Washington replied. "And maybe it always was my problem. This is my hometown, my community. The people affected by these practices are my people." He gestured toward the playground. "Those kids deserve better than to grow up fearing the people sworn to protect them." Taylor was quiet for a long moment. "I think about it every day," he finally said. "How differently things could have gone. If I'd picked someone else to pull over. If my camera hadn't malfunctioned. If you hadn't had connections." "Those aren't the right what-ifs," Washington said. "The right question isn't what if I hadn't gotten caught. It's what if I hadn't done it in the first place." Taylor nodded slowly. "I know. I think about that too." He looked directly at Washington. "I am sorry. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I am." "What will you do when your probation is over?" Washington asked. "When you're done consulting for the Justice Department?" Taylor shrugged. "I don't know. I can't be a cop again, not that I'd want to be. My record will make finding work difficult." He gave a bitter laugh. "I never thought about what happens to people after they've been in the system. Now I think about it all the time." Washington was silent for a moment, considering. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. "The community center runs a re-entry program for people coming out of incarceration, helping them find jobs, housing, rebuild their lives." He handed the card to Taylor. "When you're finished with your Justice Department work, come see me. We might have a place for you." Taylor looked stunned. "You'd help me? After what I did?" "This isn't about you or me," Washington said. "It's about the work that needs to be done. You have a perspective that could be valuable, if you're willing to use it to help others rather than yourself." Taylor stared at the card, then carefully tucked it into his wallet. "I don't know what to say." "Don't say anything," Washington replied. "Just think about it. The offer will be there when you're ready." As they walked back toward the community center, Washington received a call from General Harrington. He excused himself to take it. Washington, the general said. The secretary wants an update on your timeline. The Pentagon position is still open, but they're getting pressure to fill it. How much longer do you need there? Washington looked around at the community center, at the neighborhood beyond it. The reforms were taking root, but they were still fragile. The Oversight Committee was just beginning its work. The cultural changes within the police department would take time to solidify. Tell the secretary I'll need another 6 months. Washington decided. There's still work to be done here. Roger that, the general replied. I'll let him know. But I should warn you. They're talking about promoting you to full colonel if you take this Pentagon position. That's not an opportunity that comes along every day. Understood, sir, Washington said. But right now, this is where I need to be. After ending the call, Washington found Taylor still waiting, looking uncertain. I should go, Taylor said. Thank you for listening, Washington nodded. Remember what I said? When you're ready, the offer stands. As Taylor walked away, Washington turned back toward the community center. Through the windows, he could see people gathering for an afternoon youth program. Dwayne Lewis was setting up chairs. Mrs. Chen was organizing refreshments. And local teenagers were helping to arrange art supplies. This was the other side of the equation. Not just reforming the police, but strengthening the community. Both were necessary for lasting change. Washington's phone buzzed again. Another text from Chief Rodriguez. Community policing training going well. Officers actually engaging. Progress in small steps, but important ones. The department was changing slowly but steadily. The Oversight Committee would help ensure that the changes became permanent, embedded in the culture rather than just written in policy documents. Washington entered the community center just as the youth program was beginning. A teenage girl recognized him and waved excitedly. Colonel Washington, are you going to help with the art project today? He smiled. I think I can spare some time. As he joined the group, Washington reflected on the journey of the past 6 months. What had begun with a corrupt officer making a terrible choice had led to unexpected opportunities for healing and growth. The system was far from perfect. Reforms were always fragile, always at risk of being undermined or reversed. But for the first time in years, there was genuine hope for change. Later that evening, Washington sat in his office, reviewing applications for the center's job training program. Many came from young people in the neighborhood, including some who had had their own troubling encounters with law enforcement. His mother stopped by, bringing dinner from home. You're working too hard, she chided gently. There's a lot to do, he replied. She sat across from him, studying his face. The Pentagon called the house looking for you earlier. Sounded important? Washington nodded. They want me to head up a national initiative on police-community relations. Based in D.C. and, she prompted, I told them I need more.